Hello friends, Paper Historian here. Welcome back to the channel, where we don't just trace the gilded paths of history, we dig through the blood-soaked foundations beneath them. Tonight we're talking about slavery, not as a footnote, not as a sin long buried, but as the engine that powered empires, built fortunes, and quietly shaped the world we still live in. Slavery didn't start with chains and cotton. It started with someone deciding another human was easier to use than to understand. From ancient temples and royal courts to sugar fields and auction blocks, people have been bought, sold, branded, bred, and broken, all in the name of civilization. And no, it wasn't just a product of its time, it was the product. Traded across oceans, embedded in laws, rationalized by gods and governments. From Mesopotamia to Mississippi, from Rome to Brazil, the story remains hauntingly consistent. Someone always finds a reason to put a price tag on a person. So settle in, pour yourself something strong, and don't look away. Because this isn't just history, this is the long shadow it left behind, and some of us are still standing in it. The institution of slavery predates writing, coins, and iron. It is older than empires, older than borders, older than religion in its organized form. Wherever there were people who were owned. Not because they were inherently different, not because they were evil or weak, but because they were unlucky, and because humans, for all their poetry and temples, were capable of reducing others to tools when the structure demanded it. In Mesopotamia, the earliest records etched into clay mention slaves alongside oxen and grain. One could be enslaved for debt, for punishment, for being on the wrong side of a battle. Children were born into it. Women sold their sons to escape starvation. Men sold themselves for survival. The law codes, Unamu, Hammurabi, and those that followed, defined slaves as property, but still protected them with certain regulations. A paradox, recognized as human enough to require legal boundaries, but not enough to be free. Slavery in the ancient world was not always based on race or ethnicity. It was transactional, opportunistic, and often bureaucratic. In Egypt, slaves might have been war captives, criminals, or even peasants who had fallen into debt and were working to repay it under formal bondage. The tombs and temples filled with grandeur were not necessarily built by lash-driven masses, as Hollywood imagines, but by skilled laborers who were sometimes conscripted, sometimes enslaved, and often a murky category in between. In the Nile Delta, a slave might press olives, carry water, wash the feet of his master, or raise his master's children. Some slaves were trusted scribes, handlers of household accounts, interpreters of foreign languages. One's role was often shaped by the master's needs more than the slave's origin. And unlike later forms of racialized chattel slavery, the boundary between servant and slave was porous. Manumission was possible, though not likely. A slave could marry. A few owned property. In rare cases, a slave could rise to prominence, although the chains might only be swapped for softer ones: loyalty, assimilation, usefulness. Meanwhile, in Greece, the contradiction was even sharper. The cradle of Western philosophy, home to Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Ethics, ran on slave labor. At its peak, Athens likely had more slaves than free men. The same city that debated democracy in the agora bought and sold people in its markets. Slaves worked in the silver mines of Laurion, where death came by lung disease, exhaustion, or collapse. Others served in households, educated children, cooked meals, or stood silently beside their owners in public, invisible yet ever present. The Greeks had terms: doulos, slave, oiketes, household slave, and drapodon, literally man-footed, an animal-like term for war captives. Enslavement could happen by birth, by war, by piracy. Entire regions were drained of people during campaigns, their human spoils dragged back in chains. The Spartans had a different system, the Helots, who were not quite slaves but not free either. Bound to the land, Forced to farm for their overlords, they were ritually humiliated and occasionally slaughtered en masse to prevent rebellion. It was not just economic, it was psychological warfare, institutionalized. Rome, too, was built on slavery, grandly, openly, unapologetically. By the late Republic and early Empire, millions of slaves made the Roman machine run. They rowed the galleys, tilled the latifundia, built the roads, cleaned the vomitoriums, and stood behind senators in silent obedience. A rich Roman household might contain dozens, even hundreds of slaves, each with a specific title and function. The pure, boy servant, the lector, reader, the tunicatus, dresser, the cubicularius, bedroom servant. But again, complexity abounded. A slave could be highly educated. A Greek philosopher sold to a Roman nobleman might serve as a private tutor. A skilled artisan could work in a shop and earn money for his master. In rare cases, a slave might buy his own freedom or be freed by his owner, especially if loyal. But freedom was never truly free. Freedmen, liberti, entered a twilight caste, no longer property, but forever marked. They owed obligations to their former masters, and their children inherited the stigma. What bound all these systems together, from the ziggurats of Sumer to the villas of Rome, was the commodification of human life. Slavery was not an accident. It was not a glitch in the matrix of civilization. It was the engine. Empires required it. Wealth demanded it. And so networks developed. Slave markets, price tables, brokers, transport routes. In port cities across the Mediterranean, one could buy a human with as much ease as a jug of wine or a bolt of cloth. Age, health, skill set, virginity, all factors in the transaction. By the time a slave reached the auction block, they had likely already changed hands multiple times. War captives were sold to middlemen. Middlemen sold them to merchants. Merchants transported them across deserts or seas, sometimes branding them along the way. A single body, especially a young woman, might pass through 5 or 6 owners before ever arriving at the final destination. Each transaction stripped another layer of identity, replaced by function and value. The slave markets themselves were scenes of dehumanization and commerce. In Delos, an Aegean island once called the slave warehouse of the world, thousands of people were bought and sold daily. A seller might oil the body of a young boy to highlight muscle tone. A woman might be made to stand nude while buyers inspected teeth and breasts. Slaves were made to walk, to speak, to perform simple tasks, all part of the vetting. Defects were noted, prices haggled, contracts drawn. And yet, paradoxically, slavery was also normalized. It was not questioned in moral terms, not yet. Philosophers debated how one ought to treat a slave, not whether slavery should exist. Even when cruelty was condemned, it was not because slavery itself was wrong, but because cruelty could damage property. A good master was seen as a steward of his human capital, not an abolitionist. The few voices that hinted at universal equality, like the Stoics, were distant whispers in a cacophony of hierarchy and dominance. From Babylon to Athens, Thebes to Carthage, slavery was not merely tolerated, it was embedded. In religion, in law, in family structure, gods had slaves, kings had harems, households had servants. It was not seen as broken because it was the foundation. The ancient slave trade was not one trade, but many overlapping systems, each reflecting the values and structure of the society it served. It was transactional, brutal, institutional, and ordinary. And in this ordinariness lay its greatest horror. If the Mediterranean was a basin of classical slavery, the African continent provided a more diverse, expansive, and long-lasting theatre of human trade, both internal and external. Far from being only victims of European slave raids in the later centuries, African kingdoms and societies had their own systems of enslavement long before the first Portuguese ships appeared on the horizon. These systems varied in purpose, structure, and scale, but they all shared a central principle. Slavery was a legitimate form of wealth, power, and political leverage. In West Africa, the empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai all relied on slavery to bolster their economies. Slaves were not just laborers, they were currency. A king might gift hundreds of slaves to allies or use them to pay taxes. Others were sent northward across the Sahara in camel caravans, bound for markets in Morocco, Tripoli, Cairo. The trans-Saharan slave trade operated for over 1,000 years, with black bodies crossing the sands in chains, destined for Islamic households, military service, or concubinage. Enslavement here took many forms. War captives were the most common source, especially during expansionist campaigns. Rival tribes raided each other not merely for plunder or land, but for people. Slaves could be integrated into households, made into soldiers, or sold externally. In some societies, a slave could become part of the family over time, marrying, inheriting, even rising in status. In others, they remained permanently subordinate, especially when used for agricultural or mining labor. Some African societies developed highly organized systems. The Kingdom of Dahomey, for example, institutionalized slavery to such an extent that it became a central part of statecraft. The king maintained a standing army partially composed of enslaved people, including the infamous all-female Dahomey Amazons. The annual custom ceremony often featured public executions of slaves as a demonstration of royal power. The bodies were discarded, not as criminals, but as symbolic offerings, a sacrifice of expendable humans to elevate the sacred throne. In East Africa, the situation was different, but no less brutal. Along the Swahili coast, Arab traders developed intricate connections with local elites, buying and exporting slaves across the Indian Ocean. These individuals were often transported to the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, and even as far as India and China. Zanj slaves from East Africa were especially sought after for their perceived strength and resilience. Many worked in salt flats, plantations, or as domestic labor in affluent Muslim households. Some ended up as eunuchs, castrated before shipment to increase market value. The most infamous result of this system was the Zanj Rebellion in the 9th century, a massive uprising of black slaves in southern Iraq, many of them from East Africa. For nearly 15 years, they terrorized the Abbasid Caliphate, establishing their own territory and administration before being brutally suppressed. It was one of the largest and most successful slave rebellions in history, though it would be mostly forgotten outside of Arab chronicles. The Islamic world, more broadly, had a complex and highly bureaucratic approach to slavery. The Quran acknowledged the existence of slaves, but also encouraged humane treatment and manumission as a virtuous act. Slavery in the Islamic context was not racialized in the way it would later become in the Atlantic world. A slave could be black, white, Turkic, Slavic, Indian. What mattered was capture, not color. And while Islamic law forbade the enslavement of fellow Muslims, this rule was frequently circumvented through convenient theological gymnastics, labeling enemies as apostates or non-believers. The Ottoman Empire, a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional behemoth, turned slavery into a bureaucratic enterprise. The Devshirme system, the infamous blood tax, forcibly conscripted Christian boys from the Balkans, converted them to Islam, and trained them as elite Janissary soldiers or imperial administrators. Technically slaves of the Sultan, they often wielded more power than freeborn citizens. Many became governors, generals, even viziers. This peculiar inversion, where a slave could rise to authority over his master's countrymen, was not a loophole, but a feature of the system. At the same time, the Ottomans also trafficked African slaves for domestic labor, concubinage, and palace service. In the imperial harem, black eunuchs often held significant power as gatekeepers of the Sultan's inner court. These eunuchs had been castrated, often with crude knives, without anesthesia, and with appallingly high mortality rates. Those who survived lived lives of discipline, proximity to power, and permanent mutilation. Across the Islamic world, women were especially vulnerable. Female slaves were prized for both their labor and their reproductive capacity. Concubinage was not just tolerated, it was codified. A man could own concubines, father children with them, and those children would be considered legitimate. This made female slaves both sexual objects and dynastic assets. In elite households, a concubine might bear a prince, gaining influence by proximity. But for every such rise, thousands remained anonymous, bought for pleasure, discarded in old age, or passed from man to man as gifts. Slavery in the Islamic world was not hidden. It was part of the social architecture. Slave markets operated openly in Cairo, Baghdad, Damascus, Istanbul, Zanzibar. Contracts were notarized, prices indexed. Buyers examined flesh and teeth just as Roman buyers had centuries earlier. Some slaves were allowed to earn money, others were manumitted by pious masters seeking divine favor. Yet freedom, again, did not always bring liberation. Freedmen often remained clients of their former masters, tethered by obligation, survival, and societal inertia. The justifications, like always, were many. Some cited divine will, others pointed to tradition, economic necessity, cultural superiority. The narratives were tailored to the audience, but the result was always the same: the reduction of a person to a function. And because the Islamic world was so vast, stretching from Spain to Indonesia, its slave systems were equally diverse. But in every port, in every court, the logic remained. Some lives existed to serve others. What is remarkable is not the brutality that is almost expected, but the normalization. Like in ancient Greece or Rome, slaves were part of the family photograph, the street corner, the public record. Their presence was not a deviation, but a constant. Their absence would have been felt more profoundly than their suffering. And so, from West African grasslands to the opulent palaces of Topkapi, human bodies were traded, disciplined, and integrated. Slavery was not a flaw in the system, it was the system. It spoke every language, wore every color, prayed to every god. And it endured not because it was hidden, but because it was accepted. If the East had its slave soldiers, eunuchs, and concubines, then the Americas, long before Columbus, had their own forms of human bondage, shaped by the needs of empire, war, ritual, and labor. The idea that indigenous American societies were idyllic utopias unmarred by coercion is a myth, one often projected backward to soften the horror of their later colonization. But power, in any civilization, demands hierarchy, and hierarchy, unchecked, often demands ownership. In Mesoamerica, the Aztecs practiced a complex form of slavery called telacotli, a word which, tellingly, did not carry the full dehumanization found in European chattel slavery, but nonetheless marked an individual as subordinate. One could become a slave by birth, through debt, or by being captured in war. A man might sell himself into slavery to pay for his daughter's dowry. A gambler might wager his freedom and lose. Aztec law allowed a slave to marry, to own property, and in rare cases to buy his freedom. But he was still bound, still saleable. Slaves were not faceless tools in Aztec society. They had legal standing. Some were treated well, even affectionately, by their masters. But others met far grimmer fates. Many were used in religious rituals, their hearts cut from their chests atop pyramids, their blood spilled in offerings to Tlaloc, Huitzilopochtli, and other gods of war and rain and death. Captive warriors, especially from rival states, were considered the highest quality sacrifices, brave, strong, and pleasing to the divine. The Aztec Empire fed its cosmology with a steady stream of human lives, and slavery was one of its most efficient conduits. Among the Maya, who preceded the Aztecs and lingered in fragmented city-states long after them, slavery was likewise embedded in social life. Prisoners of war were enslaved or sacrificed. Criminals became property. Orphans and debtors could be bound to servitude. Slaves often performed domestic labor or agricultural work, but like their counterparts elsewhere, they were also part of ritual life. To be a slave was to exist on the edge of the sacred and the expendable, to be close to the gods, but only as an offering. Further south, in the Andean highlands, the Inca employed a different system, mita, which modern historians still debate. It was a rotational labor tax imposed on all subjects of the empire, where every household owed time and service to the state, building roads, farming state lands, constructing temples. It was not slavery in the technical sense. Laborers retained their family ties and property, but it functioned similarly on an imperial level. The state commanded your body for part of the year. Refusal was unthinkable. Resistance was crushed. In times of conquest or punishment, whole communities could be relocated, their labor repurposed to serve imperial needs. In some cases, outright slavery did exist in Incan society, particularly for enemies taken in war. These captives might be sacrificed, forced to serve nobles, or work in remote corners of the empire. The Inca were skilled organizers and logisticians, and their system of social control, backed by state religion and enforced through an elaborate bureaucracy, left little room for disobedience. Though the forms of bondage differed, the logic was familiar. The many served the few, and those deemed outside the moral circle could be turned into tools. In the indigenous societies of North America, slavery existed too, but in widely varying forms. Among the Pacific Northwest tribes, like the Haida, Tlingit, and Kwakiutl, slavery was hereditary and deeply entrenched. Slaves were captured in raids on rival groups, often kept for life, and their children inherited their status. They could be used for labor, domestic work, or public ritual. Some were killed in potlatch ceremonies, an act of conspicuous destruction that demonstrated the host's wealth and power. The more a chief could afford to destroy, blankets, copper, slaves, the greater his prestige. In the American Southeast, the Mississippian culture that built mound cities like Cahokia may have practiced forms of forced labor, though archaeological evidence remains fragmentary. Later, southeastern tribes such as the Creek, Cherokee, and Choctaw engaged in slave-taking, especially after contact with European colonists introduced new incentives and models. In many cases, captives were adopted into the tribe, gradually assimilated or used in marriage diplomacy. But this began to shift with European colonization, which introduced market-driven, racialized slavery, and with it, an irreversible transformation. What distinguishes the American systems of slavery prior to European arrival is not their absence of cruelty, there was plenty, but their embeddedness in social and ritual contexts. Slavery was not purely economic, it was cosmological, symbolic, and often temporary or fluid. In some cultures, a slave could become kin. In others, he was marked for death. The boundaries were not as rigid as they would become under colonial rule, but the underlying impulse, the capacity to turn people into instruments, was already present. When the Spanish and Portuguese arrived in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, they did not invent slavery in the Americas. They simply industrialized it. The encomienda system, for example, was a form of forced labor masquerading as stewardship. Conquistadors were granted rights to extract labor and tribute from indigenous communities, in theory in exchange for protection and Christian instruction. In practice, it was thinly veiled exploitation, often accompanied by violence, starvation, and disease. Entire populations collapsed under the weight of European greed and germs. Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish friar who initially supported the system, later became one of its fiercest critics. His writings document the appalling treatment of native peoples, burnings, amputations, forced marches. In one of history's darker ironies, Las Casas suggested replacing indigenous labor with African slaves, believing they were more resistant to the brutality. This would help fuel the transatlantic slave trade, which would soon reshape the world with chains and ships. The Portuguese, meanwhile, established plantations in Brazil and sugar islands off the African coast, where indigenous labor quickly proved insufficient or unsustainable. They began importing African slaves in large numbers, creating a system that combined European capitalism with African bodies and American land. This triad, Europe, Africa, the Americas, would define the next several centuries. But even before that system reached full maturity, the groundwork had been laid. Indigenous slavery, ritual sacrifice, debt bondage, labor taxation, all had demonstrated that the human body could be made a currency, a vessel for violence, a tool for empire. The arrival of Europeans did not bring slavery to the Americas. It only changed its scale, speed, and savagery. By the early 1500s, the trade in flesh had become global. African kings sold captives to Portuguese merchants. Spanish encomenderos drained entire valleys of indigenous life. Muslim traders shipped Zanj laborers to the Persian Gulf. Roman-style auctions were resurrected in Lisbon and Seville. And across the world, in fields, mines, temples, palaces, and brothels, the enslaved did what they had always done, carried the weight of someone else's ambition. What had once been scattered systems, culturally embedded, contextually varied, was rapidly being reshaped into something new, an international market, a feedback loop of bodies for profit, skin for sugar, labor for land. It would take centuries to abolish, and some would argue it never truly disappeared, only changed form. By the 16th century, the machinery of global slavery was no longer a scattered collection of localized practices. It had begun to resemble an industrial system. And nowhere was this more apparent than in the rise of the transatlantic slave trade, a structure so massive, so cruelly efficient, that it would alter not only the lives of tens of millions of Africans, but the economies, cultures, and genetic maps of entire continents. This was no longer about captives taken in battle, or criminals sold into bondage, or debtors working off what they owed. It was something colder, more calculated. It was a system built on ships, numbers, mortality rates, and projected sugar yields. It was slavery with spreadsheets. European powers, Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, the Netherlands, became commercial empires, not simply by conquering land, but by commodifying people. African bodies became units of production. Ports like Elmina, Ouida, and Benguela turned into human warehouses. African kings and warlords, many of whom had practiced slavery in their own domains for generations, adapted quickly to the market logic. They raided rival villages, waged wars with the specific aim of capturing slaves, and traded their captives for muskets, gunpowder, textiles, and rum. This was not a purely European crime. It was a collaboration. But the Europeans shaped the system's scale, brutality, and racial ideology. The African slave became not just a laborer, but a category, a lower order of being suitable only for subjugation. The pseudo-scientific racism that would later be formalized in the 18th and 19th centuries was born in the bellies of 16th century ships. It was in the logic of the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was not a metaphor, it was geography. The second leg of the triangular trade, after European goods were exchanged for slaves on the African coast, those captives were transported across the Atlantic to the Americas, where they were sold, and the ships then returned to Europe laden with sugar, cotton, tobacco, and other commodities. A standard slave ship might carry 300 to 500 captives, packed into holds with less space per person than the average coffin. Men were shackled in pairs. Women were often left unchained, but only because they were subject to the constant threat of rape. Children cried until their lungs gave out, or until silence took them forever. Dysentery was common. So was suicide. Captives jumped overboard when they could, or tried to starve themselves, only to have their mouths pried open and force-fed through devices that would later be used on animals. The death rate on these voyages could range from 10% to 20%. Some ships lost half their human cargo, and yet the system persisted because there was profit even in death. Insurance companies often paid slavers for lost property. In one notorious case, the Zong massacre of 1781, more than 130 enslaved Africans were thrown overboard so the owners could file for insurance compensation. The British courts upheld the argument that these were not murders, but losses of cargo. Once arrived in the Americas, the enslaved were washed, oiled, and auctioned. Teeth were inspected, scars were covered with grease. Men were forced to flex, women were stripped to reveal their reproductive value. It was a theater of dehumanization, rehearsed thousands of times in Charleston, Kingston, Havana, Salvador, and beyond. And then came the plantation, the final destination, the real purpose. In the Caribbean, Brazil, and the American South, the plantation was not just an agricultural unit. It was a factory of exhaustion. Sugar, in particular, was a crop that consumed lives at a rate almost unmatched by any other commodity. The planting, harvesting, and processing of sugarcane required brutal physical labor under a tropical sun, with sharp blades, endless shifts, and machinery that mangled hands as easily as cane stalks. In Brazil, which would import more African slaves than any other country, nearly 5 million in total, the average lifespan of a plantation slave was just 7 to 10 years after arrival. Replacement was cheaper than care. Family structures were discouraged. Reproduction was not prioritized. Purchase and shipment were seen as more efficient. The system treated people as consumable labor, like oxen that didn't need feeding in the off-season. In the Caribbean, the mortality rates were even higher. Barbados, Jamaica, Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, all became synonymous with sugar, profit, and premature death. The enslaved outnumbered the free, but terror kept them in line. Until it didn't. The Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, would become the most successful slave rebellion in human history, but its roots lay in the agony of the plantation system. The violence inflicted upon the enslaved was matched and eventually surpassed by the violence of their resistance. It was not a sudden explosion. It was a slow burn that had smoldered for centuries. In the American South, slavery took on a slightly different rhythm, but no less horror. Tobacco, rice, indigo, and eventually cotton drove the system. Chattel slavery, the full legal ownership of another human being and all their descendants, was enforced through laws, violence, and theology. Slaves were not just laborers. They were legal non-entities, forbidden to read, to assemble, to testify, to resist. A slave's child was a slave. A slave's rape was not a crime. A slave's death was an inconvenience to the master, nothing more. Yet within this system, life continued. Enslaved people married, secretly or unofficially. They created communities, churches, music, and language. They resisted in ways loud and silent. Some ran, some rebelled, most endured. And that endurance in itself was a rebellion. Across the Atlantic world, slave labor built cities, fortunes, and empires. It laid the foundations of modern capitalism, a term that sounds abstract until you remember that the first multinational corporations, insurance markets, and stock exchanges were deeply entangled in the trade of human beings. The Royal African Company, the Dutch West India Company, and their ilk did not just traffic goods, they trafficked lives. But slavery wasn't confined to fields. In cities like Cartagena, New Orleans, and Lima, enslaved people worked as dockhands, cooks, artisans, barbers, midwives, and even musicians. Urban slavery had its own rhythms, less grueling perhaps, but no less constricting. A slave could learn a trade, but the skill belonged to the master. A slave could earn money, but it could be taken at any moment. Some cities had systems of coartation, where a slave could buy their freedom in installments. But the cost was steep and the odds were long. The Atlantic slave system created hierarchies within hierarchies. There were house slaves and field slaves, skilled slaves and raw hands. Fancy girls sold for sex, prime males sent to the cane fields. Lighter-skinned slaves were often treated better than darker ones, an echo of the colorism that would persist long after emancipation. And for all its differences across time and space, the system shared a single, chilling constant, the logic of commodification. A person had a price. That price fluctuated with the market. If the sugar crop failed, the demand for slaves dropped. If war broke out in Africa, the supply increased, and throughout it all, the ledgers were kept. In pounds, francs, guilders, and reais. By the late 18th century, a backlash had begun, philosophical, religious, economic. Abolitionists rose in Britain, America, and France. Slave narratives, like those of Olaudah Equiano and Frederick Douglass, gave voice to the enslaved. But the machine did not stop easily. It had too many gears, too many stakeholders, too much money behind it. Even as the legal trade was outlawed, first by Denmark, then Britain, then others, the illegal trade continued. Smugglers replaced merchants, nighttime landings replaced public auctions, and so the ships sailed on. By the 19th century, the slave trade had become not just a system of labor, but a global controversy, a moral, economic, and political fault line that divided nations, families, and ideologies. The Enlightenment had birthed ideas of universal human rights, and yet those same ideas were written by men who owned other men. Jefferson penned soaring rhetoric about liberty while his plantation ran on enslaved labor. European reformers debated abolition in drawing rooms furnished by Caribbean sugar and West African ivory. What began as scattered protests and whispered doubts had grown into organized movements. In Britain, the abolitionist cause gained steam, led by voices like William Wilberforce, Granville Sharp, and the formerly enslaved Olaudah Equiano. Their campaign was not merely rhetorical, it was political, persistent, and painfully slow. They petitioned Parliament, organized boycotts of slave-produced sugar, and distributed tracts filled with testimony and diagrams, most famously the horrific layout of the slave ship Brooks, which showed hundreds of bodies packed like sardines below deck. In 1807, the British Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act, making it illegal to engage in the slave trade within the British Empire. This did not end slavery, it merely banned its international trafficking. Enforcement was patchy, resistance strong, and profits still enormous. But it marked a turning point. Britain, once a major slaving nation, now positioned itself as the world's self-appointed enforcer of abolition. The Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron patrolled the Atlantic, intercepting slave ships, freeing their human cargo, and resettling them, often in Sierra Leone, a colony founded specifically for that purpose. Other nations followed, some reluctantly, some hypocritically. The United States outlawed the international slave trade in 1808, but continued to expand slavery domestically, especially after the invention of the cotton gin made cotton cultivation vastly more profitable. The illegal trade continued for decades, with smugglers landing enslaved Africans on remote beaches in Cuba, Brazil, and the American South. Meanwhile, the internal slave trades grew stronger. In the US, the end of imports only increased the value of existing slaves. Between 1790 and 1860, nearly 1 million enslaved people were sold in the domestic trade, ripped from families in Virginia and Maryland and sold south to Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. This internal migration was known as the Second Middle Passage, and for many, it was just as traumatic as the oceanic voyage their ancestors had endured. The rhetoric of abolition gained momentum, but slavery dug in its heels. In Brazil, emancipation was a drawn-out, reluctant process. Despite pressure from Britain and internal movements, Brazil continued importing slaves until 1850 and did not fully abolish slavery until 1888, the last country in the Western Hemisphere to do so. Even then, there was no reparations, no land, no systemic support. Freedom came as a legal formality, not a social transformation. In Cuba, sugar kept the system alive. Even after Spain outlawed the slave trade, Cuban planters used loopholes, bribes, and outright defiance to continue importing Africans. American ships, sometimes flying under false flags, helped ferry human cargo. Cuban slavery wasn't abolished until 1886, and even then, the same landowners often retained control over their former slaves, now paid in wages too low to escape debt. In the Islamic world, abolition followed a different path. Since slavery had been integrated into Islamic law and society for over a millennium, it could not be undone with a single decree. Instead, it unraveled gradually, often under European pressure. In Egypt, slavery persisted officially until the 1870s. In Iran, it was abolished only in the 1920s. In Saudi Arabia, not until 1962. In Mauritania, slavery was criminalized in the 21st century, though enforcement remains deeply uneven. In Africa, the collapse of the transatlantic trade upended local economies built around slave raiding and export. Some kingdoms turned to new forms of agriculture or trade. Others collapsed entirely. Ironically, the end of external slavery led to the expansion of internal slavery in many regions. Masters were no longer exporting their human property, so they used them domestically instead. But legal abolition and actual liberation were never the same. After emancipation, freed people around the world were still denied education, land, citizenship, and safety. Many were coerced into sharecropping, debt peonage, or indentured labor, systems that replicated slavery in everything but name. In India, plantation workers signed away decades of freedom in exchange for false promises. In the American South, black codes and convict leasing re-enslaved thousands under the guise of criminal justice. In Africa and Asia, colonial powers replaced slave markets with forced labor camps and hut taxes that compelled people to work for colonial profits. The justification simply changed costume. Where once the argument had been that Africans were barbaric and needed Christian guidance, now it became that they were childlike and needed paternal colonial rule. The chains were replaced with bureaucracy, the whip with paperwork. In the 20th century, the rhetoric of human rights finally caught up with the reality of mass abuse. The United Nations, formed after the horrors of World War II, declared slavery a crime against humanity. International treaties were signed, monitoring organizations were established, public awareness rose. And yet, slavery did not end. It evolved.
Modern slavery, human trafficking, forced labour, debt bondage and child exploitation now exists in almost every country on Earth. The International Labour Organization estimates that over 40 million people live in conditions of modern slavery today. That number is higher than at any point in recorded history.
Factories in Southeast Asia, mines in Central Africa, fishing vessels off the Thai coast, domestic workers in the Gulf, brothels in Eastern Europe, migrant camps in Libya. The locations vary, but the mechanisms are familiar. Restriction of movement, seizure of documents, violence or threats, debt that cannot be repaid, isolation, psychological control. The old tools, chains, ships, auctions, have been replaced with visas, brokers, false promises, and digital surveillance. But the result is the same. A human being reduced to utility. A person priced in hours of work, not years of life. It's tempting to draw a clean line between the past and the present, to treat the transatlantic slave trade as a closed chapter, a wound healed by time. But the echoes remain. In economic disparities, in racial hierarchies, in cultural trauma passed from generation to generation. The plantations are gone, but the wealth they generated is not. The empires dissolved, but their profits are still in the foundations of modern banks, museums, and universities. Slavery built the modern world, and parts of it are still under construction. The history of slavery is not a single narrative. It is a network of systems, each adapted to its time and place, but all rooted in the same grim logic, the devaluation of life for the gain of others. It crossed continents, empires, religions, and languages. It survived revolutions, legislation, and moral outcry. And it persists, not because we don't know better, but because exploitation remains profitable. To understand slavery is not just to examine chains and auctions. It is to confront the core question that haunts all civilizations. What is a person worth? In some systems, the answer was silver. In others, sugar. In modern times, it might be a monthly quota or a trafficking fee. But until that question is answered with dignity and not price, the story of slavery will never truly end. The legacy of slavery is not just something etched into ruins or buried beneath museum glass. It's not confined to the sagging timbers of old ships, to yellowed plantation ledgers, or to the faded ink of abolitionist pamphlets. It is alive, in the shape of modern cities, in the boundaries of nations, in the prejudices we inherit, and the economic divides we normalize. To speak of ancient slavery is not to describe something safely dead. It is to recognize the bones beneath the skin of the present. In many ways, the institution of slavery was civilization's most enduring invention. Fire, agriculture, writing, metallurgy, and slavery. It co-evolved with our cities, scaled with our empires, adapted to our economies. Wherever the powerful needed labor without resistance, control without contract, production without consent, slavery emerged like mold in the architecture of human ambition. It was always there, filling the spaces between morality and profit. What distinguished different slave systems across the world was not the presence or absence of brutality. That was constant. What differed was how the brutality was framed, legally, religiously, socially. In Rome, a slave was res, a thing. In West Africa, he might be kinless, but still housed. In China, a bondservant might serve generations of the same family, part property, part member. In India, slavery was often nested within the rigid hierarchies of caste, where bonded labor blurred the lines between economic coercion and inherited inferiority. In imperial China, for example, slavery existed for thousands of years, but its forms were diverse. Some slaves were war captives, others were criminals, or children sold by impoverished parents. During the Tang and Song dynasties, palace eunuchs, many of whom had been enslaved as boys, wielded enormous influence in court politics, often more than generals or scholars. In rural China, debt bondage was widespread, where peasants unable to repay landlords were forced into servitude, their families trapped in cycles of dependency. The Mongol Empire, stretching across Eurasia, captured slaves by the tens of thousands during its relentless campaigns. Entire populations were moved, resettled, or absorbed as labor units. Persian, Chinese, Russian, and Central Asian slaves ended up in Mongol cities, some forced into labor, others, especially those with skills, used as artisans, scribes, or administrators. The Mongols didn't see slavery as a moral issue. It was logistics. Human movement as infrastructure. In India, slavery was interwoven with caste, conquest, and commerce. During the Delhi Sultanate, and later under the Mughals, large numbers of Hindu captives were enslaved during military campaigns, particularly in the north. Slaves were employed in administration, military service, and as concubines or palace attendants. The empire often drew from diverse ethnicities: Turks, Afghans, Bengalis, Abyssinians. Some, like the Habshi, Ethiopian elite in Gujarat, rose to positions of power, even ruling territories as slave-originated dynasties. but the paths to power were narrow and lined with blood. Meanwhile, in Southeast Asia, kingdoms like Angkor, Ayutthaya, and Majapahit maintained systems of slavery linked to tribute, warfare, and labor. In many of these societies, slavery was often based not on race but status and conquest. Raiding was common, and captives were used for construction, agriculture, or court entertainment. In Thailand, the that system of corvée labor existed for centuries, often indistinguishable from hereditary servitude. While not always called slavery, the underlying principle remained: coerced labor, minimal rights, and human life reduced to output. Even in regions often imagined as more egalitarian, slavery had roots. In Scandinavia, during the Viking Age, thralls, slaves, were a common part of Norse society. Captured during raids across the British Isles, Slavic territories, and beyond, these thralls were used for farming, domestic work, and occasionally human sacrifice. A Viking could trade furs, silver, or weapons for a slave in markets from Dublin to Constantinople. When Christianity reached the north, the church began to challenge the practice, but not before centuries of Norse expansion had been built on shackled backs. In Russia, slavery existed under the form of kolopy, servile individuals bound to their lords. Some were war captives, others sold themselves into bondage to escape debt or famine. Over time, especially under the Tsardom of Muscovy, these kolopy were absorbed into the growing institution of serfdom, a different kind of bondage, but bondage nonetheless. A serf was not a slave, legally, but in practice he could be sold with the land, flogged, taxed, and worked to death. By the time of Peter the Great, millions of Russian peasants lived under conditions not far removed from classical slavery. This brings us to the blurry edges of the institution, those forms of unfreedom that don't fit neatly into definitions, but which echo the same core idea: control without consent. Serfdom, indentured labor, corvée, bondage, clientage, debt servitude, each carried the same seed, and in many cases the line between servant and slave was only visible to those not living it. When slavery was finally abolished, country by country, reluctantly piecemeal, it did not vanish. It metamorphosed. In colonial Africa, European powers introduced forced labor systems that differed little from the slavery they had denounced. Villagers were compelled to build railways, collect rubber, or mine precious metals under quota and lash. In French Indochina, natives worked for pennies on land they no longer owned. In British colonies, labor camps became tools of empire. Freedom, it turned out, could be a flexible word. Even today, the descendants of the enslaved often carry burdens invisibly passed down through underfunded schools, generational poverty, systemic discrimination, cultural erasure. The past is not the past. It is layered over the present, like geological strata, visible if you know where to look. The wealth of nations that profited from slavery did not evaporate. It accrued, it compounded, it bore influence, infrastructure, and comfort. Meanwhile, the descendants of the enslaved were left to build on sand. And yet, amidst all this history, soaked in blood, gilded with profit, there is also resilience. Every slave system produced not just suffering, but survival. The enslaved sang songs in forbidden languages, passed stories through whispers, carved memories into the cracks of oppression. They plotted escapes, revolted, fell in love, raised children, kept faith. They preserved dignity where none was offered. They lived stubbornly. To tell the story of slavery is not just to describe cruelty, it is to acknowledge agency where it was denied. It is to trace not only the lash, but the breath between strikes, the moments of defiance, the quiet revolutions, the stolen joy. Slavery built palaces and pyramids, fed empires and economies. But it also left behind ghost towns, trauma, and unanswered questions. Perhaps the most important one remains. What do we owe to those who were owned? Not just apologies, not just plaques and textbooks, but attention, structural redress, historical honesty. For as long as people are still exploited, as long as labour is coerced and profit prioritised over humanity, the story of slavery continues. It is not only a lesson, it is a warning, and it is still being written. Our next story will cover the life of Roman gladiators, men whose whole purpose in life was dying for the entertainment of others. So settle in, pour yourself a cup of something warm and delicious, and listen along. The crowd is already roaring before the gates open, not for any one man, not for any specific blow or kill, but for the promise of blood. It is morning in Rome, or Capua, or Pompeii. The city changes, the ritual does not. This is the Colosseum, or some smaller amphitheatre, its stones still cool from the night, now baking under the Mediterranean sun. Men with swords will die today, and the public calls it justice, spectacle, or sport, depending on who's paying. To understand the life of a Roman gladiator is to understand a machine fueled by violence, wealth, and deeply coded performance. It was not random cruelty, it was structured cruelty. It was a system that turned human bodies into currency, into propaganda, into something between athlete and executioner. And it started, more often than not, in chains. Most gladiators were not volunteers. They were prisoners of war, criminals, runaway slaves, debtors, or just unlucky. Some were condemned under the law as damnati ad ludum, sentenced to the games as punishment. Others were simply sold into training schools, or ludi, by owners who saw more profit in blood than in labour. A few were volunteers, actorati, men who, through desperation or thrill-seeking or poverty, signed up to become professional fighters. But whether coerced or contracted, once inside the ludus, there was no turning back. The only exit was through victory, freedom, or death. The ludus was not a prison, not exactly. It was a prison with choreography. Each training school was run by a lanista, the manager who purchased, fed, punished, and profited from the men. He was part drill sergeant, part bookkeeper, part pimp. Under his supervision were instructors, often former gladiators themselves, known as doctores. These were the ones who turned terrified, half-starved captives into trained killers, or at least competent entertainment. Training was brutal, but specific. This wasn't about wild flailing. Gladiators were assigned distinct styles, weapons and personas, each with its own set of strengths and weaknesses. The Thraex, with curved sword and small shield, danced nimbly in feathered helmets. The Mumio, broad-shouldered with a fish-crested helmet, fought with the heavy gladius and rectangular scutum. The Retiarius, armed only with a net and trident, played the underdog, fast, lightly armoured, but always vulnerable. Each match was a kind of live-action chess, style versus style, armour versus agility, brute force against speed and deception. Gladiators were taught not just to survive, but to perform. Every move had to be big, readable, theatrical. A downed opponent might be ordered to draw out his death in a dramatic pose. Even suffering was part of the act. The training ground was as deadly as the arena. Injuries were constant, cracked ribs, broken jaws, deep gashes. A man might not even live to debut. Others dropped dead from exhaustion, infection, or punishment. The lanista kept records of each gladiator's value, status, and chances of survival. A promising fighter might be fed better, given a medic, even offered a small stipend. But he was still property, and property was expendable. Food in the ludus was surprisingly high-calorie, a thick barley porridge, legumes, sometimes dried fruit or cheese. Meat was rare. Gladiators needed bulk, not leanness. Fat helped protect muscles from shallow cuts. Bones healed slowly, but were less likely to be fatal if cushioned. The diet was so distinct that archaeologists today can identify former gladiators from their remains, a kind of forensic signature etched into the calcium. Some ludi were vast compounds, like the Ludus Magnus in Rome, connected to the Colosseum by an underground tunnel. Others were provincial, attached to local amphitheatres, but all operated under the same brutal logic: fight well and live, fail and die quickly, or worse, slowly, for the crowd's amusement. The games themselves were not impromptu slaughter. They were pre-scheduled, publicly funded, and often politically motivated. A wealthy patron or aspiring senator might sponsor a set of games to gain favour with the masses, the famous bread and circuses model of governance. The day began with animal hunts: lions, leopards, bulls, sometimes pitted against condemned criminals. These were the warm-up acts. Midday brought executions, crucifixions, burnings, staged mythological deaths. And then came the main event, the munera, the gladiatorial combats. There was no single rulebook. Some matches were to first blood. Others were to the death. Some were rigged. Others were dead serious. A referee or summa rudis presided over the match, armed with a staff. He could pause the fight, signal victory, or call for mercy, but the final decision often rested with the editor, the sponsor of the games. If a gladiator fell and raised his finger, the traditional plea for mercy, it was the editor who would decide his fate, often in response to the crowd's mood. If the crowd wanted blood, they would shout, "Jugula!" Kill him. If they admired the fighter's bravery, they might yell, "Mitte!" Let him go. The thumb gesture, contrary to popular belief, is historically ambiguous. The famed thumbs down may have actually meant sparing the fighter or not. Sources disagree. What is certain is that the decision to live or die could come down to the whim of a man in a toga trying to win re-election. Death in the arena was often brutal, but it wasn't always quick. Some gladiators fought until disembowelment. Others died from infection days later. Still, for all the blood, a surprising number survived multiple fights. A skilled, crowd-pleasing gladiator was an investment. Some men fought dozens of times, earning money, fame, even fans. They might be awarded wooden swords, rudis, symbols of freedom. A retired gladiator could become a trainer, bodyguard, or sometimes fade into anonymity, but many never made it past their second or third match. Despite the horror, gladiators became celebrities. Their names appeared on graffiti, their faces on oil lamps and mosaics. Women sent them notes. Rich men bet on them. Children mimicked their styles with wooden swords. In a strange twist, the most disposable men in Rome also became some of its most admired. But admiration never meant safety. A man could be cheered one day and gutted the next. There was no narrative arc, no hero's journey, only bodies in sand, weapons in hand, and a crowd hungry for more. To be a gladiator in Rome was to exist at the razor-thin intersection between violence and performance, pain and applause. It was not enough to fight well, one had to die well too. The entire structure of the Roman games revolved around visibility. The blood had to be seen, the agony had to be felt by spectators squinting in the upper tiers, and the bodies had to fall just right, like punctuation marks at the end of an epic line. And yet, despite the brutality, despite the certainty of pain and the probability of death, the gladiator was not without status. It was, bizarrely, a kind of fame. In a society that revered martial valour, the gladiator was a living allegory for Roman ideals: strength, discipline, endurance. Never mind that many of them were foreigners, criminals, or slaves. Once in the arena, stripped of name and origin, they became something closer to myth. The paradox ran deep. A gladiator was the lowest of the low, yet his likeness might appear in mosaic in a senator's villa. His name might be scratched in graffiti next to hearts and curses. He might be buried in a mass grave or honoured in a tomb, depending on who remembered him and what he had cost. Their daily lives outside the spotlight were a careful mix of control and cultivation. The ludus was a place of pain, but also of preparation. Gladiators trained in mock combat with wooden weapons called rudus, which simulated the weight of real steel but reduced fatal accidents in practice, not out of mercy, but out of economic logic. A dead trainee was a wasted investment. They practiced maneuvers endlessly: lunges, sidesteps, shield blocks, feints. Doctors barked corrections. Punishments were frequent, often public. Mistakes could earn lashings, time in stocks, or worse. But praise, when it came, was rare and meant survival. A fighter who showed promise might be given better food, cleaner quarters, even medical treatment from a medicus, if the ludus had one. Their bodies bore the record. Scars became maps of past matches. Healed bones testified to brutality survived. Gladiators didn't wear armor that covered the entire body. That would make fights boring. Instead, the armor was asymmetrical and exposed. A mumio might have one heavily armored arm and leg, but the rest of his body was open to injury. A retiarius wore almost nothing, trusting in speed and distance to stay alive. This ensured more blood, more risk, more drama. The variety of styles served a narrative function. Matches were like live mythologies: the agile versus the strong, the light versus the armored, the underdog versus the juggernaut. It wasn't just combat, it was curated spectacle. The Roman crowd loved patterns, matchups, surprise reversals. The editor of the games, often a political figure, chose opponents to maximize entertainment, not fairness. And gladiators studied one another, learned weaknesses, rivalries, temperaments. In the ludus, you trained beside men you might one day kill. Despite the danger, camaraderie often developed. Not loyalty, that was too much to hope for, but a kind of tribal bond. Men shared bread, wine, and rumours. They tended each other's wounds when the medicus was slow. They told stories of fallen brothers, of fights that went wrong, of moments when death passed them over. Some had nicknames. Others had families who came to visit, though not often. Children might grow up seeing their father only between matches, if at all. And then there were the women. Gladiators, despite their legal status, became objects of erotic fascination in Roman society. Upper-class women, bored in their marble villas, sometimes sent letters, gifts, or invitations to their favourites. It was said that gladiator sweat was bottled and sold as an aphrodisiac. Some women went so far as to buy gladiators outright, or at least rent their time. Roman satire delighted in mocking these relationships, painting them as depraved or laughable. But the underlying dynamic was rarely funny. Men used for death, then used for pleasure. The Roman elite viewed gladiators with ambivalence. On one hand, they were disgusting, foreign, criminal, expendable. On the other, they were thrilling, dangerous, masculine in the purest, rawest sense. A senator might decry the games in the Senate, then cheer from the front row the next morning. Even the emperor was not immune. Some emperors fought in the arena themselves, usually in staged or farcical bouts, of course. Commodus, the son of Marcus Aurelius, fancied himself a gladiator and staged hundreds of victories against wounded animals or helpless opponents. He charged the treasury for his appearances. His reign ended in assassination. For the empire as a whole, the games served a dual purpose: distraction and demonstration. They distracted the populace from hardship, poverty, and political rot. And they demonstrated Rome's absolute mastery over life and death. Executions in the arena weren't just punishment, they were propaganda. Criminals were dressed as mythological villains and slain in elaborately staged scenes. A man playing Icarus might be flung from a platform. Another playing Hercules might battle a lion with a wooden club and lose, to the crowd's delight. But while those deaths were preordained, a gladiator's fate was always uncertain. That was the appeal. He might fall, or he might rise. A particularly skilled fighter could become a champion, winning bout after bout, collecting fame, prize money, and sometimes even freedom. Those who earned the wooden sword, rudies, were granted release from the games, though not always from poverty or stigma. Still, to retire from the sand was rare and envied. Some stayed on as trainers, others faded into poverty. A few opened small schools, hoping to pass on their techniques to fresh recruits. The Lannister continued to recruit from prisons, slave auctions, and among desperate freemen. The cycle never ended. As long as there was a crowd to cheer, there would be men to fall. And yet, for all its savagery, there was a strange logic to it all. In the arena, the rules were brutal, but they were known. A man could fight, win, be cheered. For some, it was the first time in their lives anyone had ever remembered their name, even if it was carved in marble beside a sword. That, perhaps, was the tragedy of the gladiator's life. Not just that it was short, or painful, or violent, but that it was the only way, in Roman eyes, a man of low birth could become immortal. It is easy to think of gladiators as a singular class, a uniform group of doomed fighters sharing the same sand and steel. But gladiatorial life, like Roman society itself, was deeply hierarchical. Even among the enslaved, there were ranks. Even among those condemned to die, some were closer to fame or comfort or privilege. Blood was the currency, but not everyone bled the same. At the top stood the veterani, seasoned fighters who had survived multiple matches. They were the closest thing the arena had to living legends. Their names were sometimes known outside the ludus, etched into graffiti, whispered in the marketplace. A veteranus might be granted special meals, better armor, fewer duties. He had earned respect not by his birth, which was usually forgotten, but by endurance. Survival itself was a kind of nobility. Then came the tyrones, the rookies, fresh from slave markets or military disgrace, wide-eyed and underfed. Their training was more punishing. They slept in cramped quarters. They made the mistakes others could not afford to. They learned by copying, by absorbing, by failing in ways that weren't fatal, yet. Most would not last long. The arena chewed through tyrones the way a storm chews through ships. And then there were the bestiarii, the beast fighters. These men, often criminals or prisoners sentenced at bestias, were not considered true gladiators. They were rarely trained, given poor equipment, and thrown into the arena with lions, leopards, or bulls as public execution. The crowd loved the mismatch. It affirmed Rome's supremacy over nature and man alike. But some bestiarii survived. A few even specialized in it, learning to dodge, to exploit the instincts of animals. One man's punishment could become another man's craft. For the most part, however, these men were there to die, loudly, messily, entertainingly. The weapons they carried varied not only by fighting style, but by symbolic meaning. The secutor, with his smooth helmet and heavy shield, was the juggernaut. His nemesis was the retiarius, armed only with a net, trident, and a dagger. The pairing was deliberate. Brute force versus agility, heavily armored certainty versus exposed improvisation. The retiarius had no helmet. His face was visible. He was the underdog, the tease, the dancer. To beat a secutor was not just victory, it was humiliation for the other side. Other types included the hoplomachus, inspired by Greek hoplites, and the daimochairus, who wielded two swords at once. Some schools developed hybrid styles. Regional preferences varied. In the East, lighter styles were favored. In the West, heavier. The crowd did not just want blood, they wanted novelty. And the editors delivered. The social identity of gladiators was equally complex. Many were foreigners: Gauls, Thracians, Nubians, Dacians, Syrians. Rome's expansion across 3 continents meant a constant supply of bodies. Ethnicity became part of the spectacle. A Nubian might be made to fight under the burning sun, dressed in mock tribal garb, his skin exoticized for Roman entertainment. A Gaul might be costumed in exaggerated barbarian attire, playing the savage even if he had once been a farmer or a soldier. It was theatre with real consequences. Language barriers made communication inside the ludus difficult, but necessity bred innovation. Fighters developed their own gestures, slang, ways of communicating before a match or during training. The arena was multilingual, multicultural, and entirely Roman in its indifference to origin. You were what you could do with a weapon, or what you could survive. Religion, too, was present. Before entering the arena, some gladiators made offerings to Nemesis, goddess of retribution. Others prayed to Mars or Fortuna, or even foreign gods brought from their homelands. Superstition was rampant. Amulets were worn under armor. Charms were buried under the sand. Some fighters refused to be matched on certain dates. The idea that fate had a script and that the gods might be bribed to rewrite it gave a measure of comfort. But it wasn't just the fighters who lived in fear of fate. The Roman elite knew that the same crowd cheering a beheading could turn on them next. The games were political, and the mood of the mob mattered. A poorly staged munus could ruin a career. An unpopular execution could spark a riot. Gladiators, in their strange way, were political tools, symbols of authority, of generosity, of spectacle. To fund games was to demonstrate power. To die in them was to preserve it. Some emperors leaned into this symbolism more than others. Titus, who inaugurated the Colosseum, staged 100 days of games, during which thousands died, not just men, but animals from across the empire. Trajan, after a victorious campaign, celebrated with spectacles so vast they became legend. The arena was more than entertainment. It was a victory lap for empire. For the crowd, the appeal was layered. There was the thrill of violence, yes, but also the illusion of control. Spectators could vote on life or death, cheer for their favorite, curse the coward, praise the brave. They were not just watching, they were participating. The amphitheatre flattened social lines. Senators sat beside butchers. Merchants shouted alongside soldiers. All eyes on the sand, all hearts pounding to the same rhythm. And then there was the possibility of surprise. A match might begin predictably, the heavier man pressing, the agile one dodging, and then twist. A dropped weapon, a feint, a sudden reversal. The crowd lived for those moments when death seemed imminent, and then wasn't. When a doomed man rose and claimed the day, it was a kind of catharsis, a reenactment of survival played out so the audience didn't have to risk it themselves. For the fighters, that reversal could mean everything. A single well-fought match might buy a month of better food. A mercy granted might lead to freedom. A victory celebrated might earn a name, carved in stone, remembered by the few who cared. But for most, the end came suddenly. A misstep, a deeper cut, a command from above. The sand soaked it all up without complaint. The columbarium, or gladiator's tomb, was usually modest. Mass graves were common. A few were lucky, if luck is the right word, to have their names recorded. Some were buried by friends, some by patrons. A handful had epitaphs. He fought bravely. He won 12 times. He died young. No one carved he was a slave, but everyone knew. There were moments, rare and flickering, when the life of a gladiator almost resembled something like agency. A champion of the games, a man who had survived 10, 20, even 30 matches, might begin to feel the weight of his own myth. The crowd remembered his name. Merchants sold cheap figurines carved in his likeness. Women sent letters and hairlocks tied with twine. A Lannister might boast that his man was invictus, undefeated. And somewhere beneath the armor and scarring, the fighter might start to believe it himself, that he was more than just flesh rented by the day, that he had a future. But myths don't last long in places built for blood. For every gladiator who gained celebrity, dozens more passed through the sands with no name, no ceremony, no legacy. They died anonymously, young, broken, and largely forgotten. The arena did not reward consistency, it rewarded spectacle, and even the best could fall out of favour after one bad performance or an inconvenient injury. Some champions, however, did manage to retire. The symbolic gift of the rudi, a wooden sword representing freedom, was rare but not unheard of. A man granted his freedom might remain with the ludus as a trainer, passing on his techniques to new recruits. Others tried to fade into civilian life, often unsuccessfully. The Roman public had a short memory, and without the armour and glare of the amphitheatre, a retired gladiator was just another scarred man without a trade. Worse still, many former gladiators had no real legal protection. Even as freedmen, their past tainted them. Roman law considered infamia, a loss of reputation, a permanent stain. Gladiators, actors, prostitutes, and others involved in public spectacle were all branded with it. They couldn't hold public office, couldn't testify in court, and were considered morally suspect. It didn't matter how bravely they had fought. The law saw them as tainted by the very profession Rome had built monuments to. Still, some found ways to survive. A few wealthy patrons adopted retired fighters as bodyguards, or hired them to train private militias. Others were absorbed into organized crime or became bestiarii, professional animal hunters who continued to perform in the games, often with more risk and less reward. A small number opened their own ludi, recruiting the desperate and the condemned, perpetuating the very system that had once consumed them. The existence of female gladiators, gladiatrices, was rare, but not mythical. Despite modern portrayals, they were never common, and Roman sources often treated them as curiosities rather than athletes. Their presence in the arena was sometimes used to shock or titillate, especially during the reigns of emperors like Nero or Domitian, who were fond of theatrical excess. These women were usually slaves or criminals, and they fought under similarly codified rules, though with less dignity afforded to them. Some emperors eventually banned their participation, not out of concern for their well-being, but because they considered it unseemly for women to perform in such roles, not cruel, just improper. Children, too, were not entirely spared from the games. Young boys could be trained in pueri ludentes, playing boys, mock fighting for the entertainment of noble households. Some of these children, particularly if orphaned or enslaved, would later graduate into the real arena. They were raised in violence, groomed for death, and if they were lucky, they died quickly. The unlucky ones lived long enough to understand exactly what they had become. Gladiator games extended beyond Rome's walls. They spread with the empire to Gaul, Hispania, Africa, Britannia, and the Greek East. Amphitheatres were built in provincial towns, often as symbols of Roman control. Local elites sponsored games to demonstrate loyalty to the emperor, and provincial crowds learned to cheer in Latin even if they cursed in their own tongue. But not everyone cheered. Early Christian writers condemned the games as barbaric, not just for their violence, but for what they revealed about Roman values. Figures like Tertullian and Augustine spoke against the amphitheatre, describing it as a place where the soul was poisoned by spectacle. The famous story of Alypius, Augustine's friend, tells of a man dragged to the games who vowed not to look, but who, upon hearing the crowd, opened his eyes and became immediately addicted. That was the arena's power. It didn't just entertain, it consumed. As Christianity spread, so did pressure to end the games. Over centuries, that pressure mounted, but it was not moral outrage alone that doomed the gladiatorial system. It was also economics. The cost of training, housing, and feeding gladiators was high. Animal shows and mock naval battles grew cheaper and more popular. By the 5th century CE, as the Western Roman Empire staggered toward collapse, the games became more occasional, less grand, and finally disappeared altogether. The last known gladiatorial fight in Rome is believed to have taken place in 404 CE, when a Christian monk named Telemachus entered the arena and tried to stop the violence. Accounts differ. Some say the crowd stoned him to death, others that guards killed him. But the story ends the same way. His death sparked such outrage that the Emperor Honorius banned gladiatorial combat. Whether the story is apocryphal or not, the symbolism is clear. The sword gave way to the cross. But symbols don't erase scars. The gladiators may have died, but the idea of them didn't. Medieval Europe romanticized them. Renaissance scholars dissected their gear and philosophy. Modern culture, cinema, television, games reimagines them as noble warriors, misunderstood heroes, lone wolves fighting for freedom. Rarely do these stories show the lice, the hunger, the public beatings, or the fear of being disemboweled in front of 50,000 people for losing a coin toss. In the end, the gladiator was not a hero. He was not a villain. He was a man placed inside a machine, given weapons, denied rights, and told to fight for someone else's amusement. Some embraced it, some endured it. Some died hating every moment, but all of them bled under the same sun. Behind the spectacle, behind the roars of the Colosseum and the gleaming helmets in the sun, gladiators lived in a world of constant calculation. Every day was a negotiation between pain and survival, humiliation and dignity, brutality and showmanship. They were not just fighters, they were performers. And in Rome, performance was everything. The arena was never just a stage for blood. It was a mirror held up to the empire. It reflected the values Rome held highest: domination, discipline, and display. A gladiator embodied all three, and so he was both admired and reviled. The crowd screamed for his victory one moment, then demanded his execution the next. His body belonged to the audience as much as it did to his owner. This sense of being public property extended beyond the arena itself. Gladiators were paraded through city streets before games, marched in from the ludus in chains or in formation, depending on the tone of the event. They were forced to wear signs around their necks stating their names, fighting styles, and previous record, like livestock before auction. This dehumanization was part of the ritual. Rome loved its champions, but it never forgot they were slaves. During major festivals, such as the Saturnalia or imperial birthdays, the number of games increased dramatically. These were moments of heightened violence when the rules were loosened and the stakes were raised. Special matches were arranged, including mass combat between groups of gladiators, grigatim, staged naval battles in flooded amphitheatres, naumachiae, and executions reenacting famous myths or treacheries from history. The line between theatre and murder disappeared completely. The planning behind these events was meticulous. Slaves were catalogued and paired in ways that maximized contrast. A towering Germanic Mumio against a wiry Syrian Retiarius, a blindfolded Dimacharius against a heavily armoured Hoplomachus. Opposites delighted the crowd. It was combat by design. And yet, despite this orchestration, unpredictability remained the most intoxicating element. A weak fighter might prevail with a lucky strike. A champion might slip in blood and fall under an amateur's blade. The arena was Rome's only equalizer. No title, no family name, no bribe could save you once the match began. That was its savage purity. The gladiators' relationships with each other were layered and fraught. They trained together, lived together, sometimes fought to the death. Rivalries were common. So were bonds, forged in sweat and trauma. Stories survive of fighters refusing to kill fallen comrades, forcing the editor to decide instead. Others whispered to each other before combat, agreeing on how long to draw out the match before the inevitable. But betrayal was always an option. A single misstep in trust could be fatal. In the arena, friendship was not armor. In some ludi, gladiators were divided into factions, color-coded groups with internal hierarchies. Trainers fostered competition, favoring some, punishing others. A favored fighter might receive better gear, protection from harsh matches, or even private training sessions. Others were thrown into hopeless matchups for practice or punishment. Discipline was constant. Some lanistae resorted to extreme measures: starvation, flogging, forced isolation. Not all gladiators feared the arena most. For many, it was the ludus itself that broke them. Medical care varied widely. Some larger ludi, like those attached to imperial funds, had trained physicians. Others relied on old fighters with basic knowledge. Wounds were common: deep cuts, broken bones, concussions. But there were no antibiotics, no anesthesia, and no guarantees. A lucky wound might scar. An unlucky one might fester and kill days later. Some men hid their injuries to avoid being pulled from upcoming matches. Better to risk dying in the arena than rotting in a fever-ridden cell. Despite all this, records show that some gladiators managed to fight 10, 20, even 50 times. These men were more than survivors. They were investments. Their value increased with each victory. They were loaned out to other games, rented between lanistae, even used in advertising. One famous fighter, Flamma, was awarded the rudis 4 times and refused it each time, choosing instead to remain in the arena. Whether this was pride, fear, or a kind of identity crisis is unknown, but it illustrates a deeper truth. For some men, the arena became home. The outside world offered only anonymity and poverty. Occasionally, politics crept into the arena. During periods of civil unrest or imperial instability, gladiators were used to influence public opinion. Matches were rigged, heroes were manufactured. A charismatic fighter might be adopted as a symbol of rebellion, loyalty, or ethnic pride. Emperors sometimes staged games to distract from scandal or soften a brutal policy. Bread and circuses were not just metaphors, they were strategy. And when the empire went to war, it sometimes brought the games with it. Portable arenas were constructed in military camps. Gladiators were made to fight in front of legions, both as entertainment and as reminders of Roman order. Some fighters, if they had once been enemy soldiers, were forced to kill men from their own homeland, an added cruelty masked as sport. The economy of the games was staggering. A well-trained gladiator could cost as much as a small estate. The construction and maintenance of amphitheatres, the logistics of animal hunts, the salaries of guards, trainers, medics, and bureaucrats. It was a full-blown industry. Slavery powered it, but aristocracy funded it. And no senator ever lost office by promising more games. But the very scale of it all eventually became a burden. As the empire declined, so too did the funds for games. The amphitheatres began to crumble, the quality of matches decreased, audiences thinned. The Christian emperors outlawed the worst spectacles, and gladiators were gradually replaced with safer, tamer entertainments, chariot races, theatre, executions held behind closed doors. What remained was the mythology. The figure of the gladiator outlived the games themselves. He became a symbol of resistance, of fatalism, of raw masculinity. In centuries to come, poets, painters, and playwrights would romanticize him, turning his suffering into virtue, his chains into metaphors. They forgot the sores, the lice, the smell of sweat and copper. They remembered only the sword. The dust settles quickly in the arena, but the echo of death takes longer to fade. By the time the Colosseum fell silent and the swords were sheathed for good, the institution of gladiators had already become legend. The last real blood spilled on the sand had barely dried before the Romans themselves began mythologizing it, smoothing over the rot, elevating the fighters from condemned criminals and expendable slaves to tragic warriors and reluctant heroes. It was a convenient fiction. Rome, like every empire, preferred to remember its cruelty as ceremony. Gladiators were never meant to be remembered as individuals. The system was built to use them, discard them, and replace them. Their names were not carved into triumphal arches. No statues were raised in their honor. They didn't write books, didn't lead armies, didn't pass laws. Most died before they reached 30. Their graves, when they had them, were modest, small stone slabs with a name, a weapon, a record. Fought 9 times, won 7, died well, and yet they endured. In the centuries that followed, the image of the gladiator was stripped of its historical grime and recast in bronze and marble. The Renaissance artists gave them perfect proportions and noble expressions. Romantic poets wept over their suffering. By the 19th century, they were appearing in operas, novels, and melodramas, doomed to champions of honor and dignity, dying not for entertainment, but for ideals. Modernity only deepened the myth. Films turned them into rebels, lovers, philosophers in armor. Audiences around the world cheered for cinematic gladiators who defied emperors and inspired revolutions. The real men, who had once been chained together in lice-ridden barracks, became symbols of resistance. Their beatings were forgotten. Their broken teeth were replaced with square jaws. Their slavery was rewritten as sacrifice. It was a beautiful lie. The truth was messier. Most gladiators died nameless. They were tools, blunt, temporary, and replaceable. The few who lived long enough to gain notoriety did so at great cost. They bled for Roman amusement. They endured fractured skulls, shattered ribs, and the humiliation of being property in a city that worshipped glory. Their victories didn't earn them freedom, just more fights. Their rewards were often worse than their defeats. And the closest many came to dignity was dying cleanly in front of a crowd that forgot them by nightfall. But it would be too simple to say they were only victims. They were something else too, survivors inside a death machine, performers who learned how to twist violence into spectacle, men who fought not just to live, but to mean something, however briefly. Their struggle was not glorious, but it was real, and it was public. For Rome, that publicness was the point. Gladiators served as reminders of imperial might, of social order, of what happens to those who fall. They were visual metaphors for control. The empire needed the crowd to cheer the execution, not just witness it. In doing so, Rome taught its citizens how to accept cruelty as culture, punishment as politics, and slavery as entertainment. That lesson has outlived the amphitheaters. Today, we may no longer fill stone arenas to watch men stab each other, but we still consume violence. We still reward spectacle. We still romanticize struggle when it's packaged well enough. The idea of turning suffering into a story, a brand, is not new. The gladiators were just the prototype. And perhaps, on some level, the fascination remains because gladiators expose a part of the human condition we prefer to dress up, our hunger for control, our awe of death, and our deep, dangerous admiration for those who seem willing to face both in public. A gladiator was never just a fighter. He was a man given a script written in blood and told to make it art. In the ruins of amphitheaters across Europe and North Africa, the outlines of the arenas still remain. Oval footprints etched into the earth, sand long gone, but stones still watching. Tourists walk the same tunnels where fighters once waited their turn to die. Guides speak in sanitized tones, cameras click, children pose, and below that, in the ground, lie the bones of those who never had names, only numbers, only scars, only silence. If they could speak now, perhaps they would not ask to be remembered as heroes, but as men who lived hard, died harder, and carried the weight of an empire's entertainment on their shoulders, not for glory, not for freedom, but because someone else wanted a better view from the stands. Settle in and get comfortable, because our next story will focus on the Great Wall of China, how it was built, who built it, and most importantly, why it was created in the first place. The Great Wall of China was never a single wall, and it was never truly great to those who built it. For them, it was a sentence, carved into mountains, dragged across deserts, sunken into river valleys. It was less a monument than a command. Stretching over 20,000 kilometers in its fragmented totality, built across dynasties, provinces, and centuries, the wall was not so much one structure as it was an evolving system of fear, labor, and political performance. Its purpose was never purely defensive. Though it was framed as a shield against nomadic raids, it was also a symbol, a visible expression of central power, a bureaucratic line drawn across the wilderness, a message to both enemies and citizens alike. There is an inside and an outside, and we decide who belongs to which. The idea of walls in China predates the wall by centuries. As early as the Warring States period, 475 to 221 BCE, regional kingdoms constructed rammed earth barriers to define territory and delay incursions. These early walls were modest but functional, built from layers of compacted earth and gravel, sometimes reinforced with wood. They followed the contours of the land, rose only a few meters high, and relied more on watchtowers and patrols than actual impassability. When Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, took power in 221 BCE, he inherited a patchwork of these fortifications. He ordered them linked, reinforced, and extended, not because the frontier had suddenly become more dangerous, but because unity demanded visible proof. This early phase of the Great Wall was primitive by later standards. It was made with rammed earth, packed between wooden boards, layer by layer, dried under the sun. It was quick to construct and quicker to erode. Labour came from conscripted soldiers, convicts, and peasants. The wall was not built by willing hands. It was built by decree, often under deadly conditions. Workers toiled in remote regions with little food, primitive tools, and no medical care. Starvation and disease were common. Corpses were sometimes buried in the wall itself, not as a ritual, but as disposal. Estimates vary, but hundreds of thousands are believed to have died during the Qin Wall's construction. There are no names on those early stones, no markers for those who collapsed and disappeared under the dust. Their legacy is the structure itself, impersonal, immense, and indifferent. The wall served more than military functions. It was also a tax boundary. It controlled migration, regulated trade, and helped enforce the centralized administration that Qin so ruthlessly established. Gates and checkpoints along the wall were staffed by officials who tracked who came and went, who owed what to whom. It was a fence, a customs office, a prison, and a propaganda platform, all in one. After the fall of the Qin dynasty, later rulers added, repaired, or abandoned sections of the wall depending on the priorities of their reigns. During the Han dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, the wall was pushed deeper into the western deserts, following the expansion of the empire along the Silk Road. Here, it served less as a defense against cavalry and more as a lifeline, protecting garrisons, oases, and trade posts in arid, lawless lands. Han-era walls combined rammed earth with stone, depending on available materials. In rocky regions, stones were used for foundations and tower bases. In deserts, tamarisk twigs and reeds were layered into the earth to add cohesion. These walls were not beautiful. They were practical, rough, and often eroded within decades unless maintained. Labour under the Han was slightly more structured but no less punishing. Convicts were still used, often sentenced to decades of service. Border peasants were required to contribute labour as part of their corvée obligations, unpaid forced labour owed to the state. Soldiers rotated in and out of wall duty. Conditions were brutal. Winter cold that split fingers, summer heat that dried lips to cracking. Some posts were so remote that garrisons developed their own dialects, barely recognizable to officials in the capital. The wall's military function remained ambiguous. It was not truly impassable. Nomadic horsemen, the Xiongnu, Turkic tribes, and later the Mongols, could and did breach it, circumvent it, or buy passage through it. Battles were won and lost, regardless of the wall's presence. It served more as a deterrent and a delay, buying time for garrisons to respond, funneling enemies into kill zones, making surprise attacks more difficult. It was defense by inconvenience. But to the emperors, the wall was a performance. A ruler who repaired and extended it showed vigilance, power, and legitimacy. A ruler who let it crumble invited whispers of weakness. Stone and earth were political currency. The wall was a message not just to the nomads, but to the mandarins, the military governors, the court. By the time of the Tang dynasty, 618 to 907, emphasis on the wall had waned. The Tang preferred diplomacy and offensive campaigns to static defense. The frontier shifted, priorities changed, the wall eroded. But it would rise again. The most iconic sections of the Great Wall, the ones tourists walk today, with crenellated stone parapets and brick towers winding like a dragon over green mountains, came much later, under the Ming dynasty, 1368 to 1644. These were not mud ramparts, but massive engineering projects involving bricks fired in kilns, stone quarried from mountains, and mortar mixed with lime water and glutinous rice for extra adhesion. But the cost would be staggering. The Ming Wall would become the largest construction project in human history up to that point, and those who built it would pay for it with more than time. When the Ming dynasty rose to power in the 14th century, it did so in the shadow of conquest. The Mongol Yuan dynasty had collapsed, but the memory of Mongol cavalry thundering through northern China had not faded. The Ming emperors, burned by the failure of relying on diplomacy or passive defense, chose a different strategy: containment through walls. And unlike their predecessors, they didn't just rebuild the frontier. They reimagined it, wider, higher, thicker, stronger. The result was the most recognizable phase of the Great Wall. The Ming Wall was no longer a dirt embankment designed to slow nomads. It became a massive, fortress-like structure, engineered with a new focus on longevity and symbolic dominance. Its scale was imperial, its detail meticulous. It wound across mountains, hugged valleys, snaked along ridgelines where climbing itself was a feat. But its true cost was measured in more than bricks or silver. It was measured in backs broken by labor, in lives lost on scaffoldings, in frozen hands gripped around chisels high in the northern wind. The materials reflected the ambitions. In flat plains and river valleys, baked bricks were used, uniform, durable, and easier to stack. Along mountainous terrain, quarried stone formed the base and facade, with the interior filled by crushed earth, lime, and rubble. Where clay soil was plentiful, earth was tamped between wooden frames, a method that had been used for centuries, now refined with more precision. In some sections, lime mortar was mixed with sticky rice soup to enhance bonding strength, an accidental innovation that gave the wall surprising resilience. The wall was not a continuous line, but a system of fortifications. It included watchtowers spaced at intervals for signalling and surveillance, beacons for relaying messages through smoke by day and fire by night, barracks, arsenals, and garrisons embedded along the route. Communication moved fast. In theory, a beacon fire lit at one end could be observed and relayed hundreds of kilometers down the line in a matter of hours. The wall itself became a nervous system for the Ming military, allowing a centralized command to monitor a sprawling frontier. But none of this came easily. Construction was slow, brutal, and required an enormous labor force. At its height, The project mobilized hundreds of thousands of workers, soldiers, conscripted peasants, criminals, artisans, masons, and slaves. The imperial court drafted men from northern provinces, often forcibly. Many walked hundreds of kilometers just to reach the work sites where conditions were primitive and deadly. Workers slept in tents or cave dwellings, lived on millet gruel and salted vegetables, and labored through blistering summers and bitter winters. Accidents were constant, from rock slides, collapsing scaffolds, or simple exhaustion. Disease was endemic. Frostbite claimed fingers. Dysentery claimed more. There was no formal medical system. Corpses were sometimes buried near the wall, sometimes within it, though not out of ritual, simply because transporting the dead was a luxury no one could afford. Punishment for desertion was severe. Guards monitored workers, and attempts to escape were met with branding, mutilation, or execution. Families of those who fled could face fines, land seizure, or imprisonment. For many, the wall was a one-way journey, not toward glory, but toward an anonymous death in service of an emperor they would never see. The why behind this suffering wasn't just fear of northern tribes, though Mongol and later Manchu raids were genuine threats. It was also about imperial confidence. The wall was a message carved into stone. This is China, and we do not yield. It delineated the edge of civilization, not just geographically, but ideologically. Inside the wall was order, culture, Confucian hierarchy. Outside was the steppe, chaos, mobility, the horse-riding barbarians the court feared and despised in equal measure. But the irony was that the wall's presence often provoked the very violence it was meant to prevent. Tribes that had once traded or negotiated with Chinese officials now found themselves excluded, humiliated, and targeted. Some retaliated, others bypassed. The steppe was wide. The wall, however vast, could not cover every crevice. Mongol raiders would simply ride around it, or strike isolated sections. It was not an unbreakable defense. It was a symbol of one. Administratively, the wall became a logistical nightmare. Repair was constant. Floods damaged foundations. Erosion crumbled towers. Earthquakes leveled entire segments. The empire poured enormous resources into maintenance, deploying engineers, surveyors, garrisons, and supply chains to keep the system functioning. Documents from the Ming archive reveal endless reports of rot, cracks, collapse, and budget shortfalls. Commanders posted to wall sections were often underpaid, under-resourced, and accused of corruption. Supplies went missing, tools rusted, garrisons went months without reinforcements. And yet the orders from the capital remained the same: build, guard, endure. Life for the soldiers stationed along the wall was only marginally better than for the laborers who built it. Soldiers lived in forts known as zhai or tun, small walled compounds where they grew food, trained, and froze through the winter. Morale was low. Pay was often late. Their primary enemies were not Mongols, but boredom and hunger. Patrols were long and dangerous. Fights were rare but vicious. Skirmishes often ended with mutilation, hostage-taking, or retaliatory raids. Despite all this, the wall became deeply embedded in Chinese culture. It appeared in poetry, in paintings, in political speeches. It was used to frame ideas of loyalty and duty, often in cruel contrast to the actual experience of those who died constructing it. One Ming poem praised the 10,000 li of righteous stone. Another warned young men, a soldier on the wall never returns with black hair. The myth of unity and strength built into the wall masked the human cost beneath it. Dynasties rose and fell, frontiers shifted, but the laborers remained anonymous, their bones crushed beneath the weight of imperial ambition. By the late Ming period, the wall had grown so vast and expensive that many officials began to question its value. And still, it was defended, not only as a military necessity, but as a moral one. To abandon the wall was to abandon vigilance. To abandon vigilance was to invite chaos. And so the work continued, even as cracks began to show, not just in the mortar, but in the very foundations of the empire. Soon, those cracks would widen, and the wall, for all its stone and sacrifice, would not hold. By the dawn of the 17th century, the Great Wall, or what the Ming called the Wanli Changcheng, the 10,000 li-long wall, stood as both pride and burden. A line of stone and labour stretching across mountains, deserts, rivers and emptiness, patrolled by underfed soldiers and maintained by overstretched bureaucrats. It was one of the most massive architectural undertakings in human history, and one of the least effective. The problem was not with the wall itself. Stone towers still rose like teeth from the earth, signal fires still burned, the beacons still blinked across the northern horizon. The problem was with the system that relied on the wall, brittle, corrupt, and bleeding at every edge. Despite decades of reinforcement, the wall could not halt the gradual rise of the Manchus, a semi-nomadic people from beyond the northeastern frontiers who, like the Mongols before them, combined cavalry skill with political acumen. The Manchus did not need to storm the wall head-on. They exploited its blind spots. They bribed border commanders. They used winter rivers and mountain passes where the wall thinned or disappeared. In 1644, the wall finally failed in the most symbolic way possible. A Ming general, Wu Sangui, opened the gates at the Shanhai-Guan Pass, one of the wall's most formidable strongholds, to let the Manchus through. Not because he was deceived, not because he was outnumbered, but because the empire behind the wall had already begun to rot. What the bricks could not protect was already collapsing in marble. The Manchus would go on to establish the Qing dynasty, which ruled China until the early 20th century. And although they maintained and repaired parts of the wall, they saw it less as a military necessity and more as a symbol, a relic of a previous regime's paranoia. The Qing expanded China's borders far beyond the wall into Mongolia, Tibet, and Central Asia. The Great Wall, once the edge of civilization, was now just a middle line in a much larger frontier. Its garrisons were reduced, its towers left to crumble. In some areas, local villagers stripped its bricks for homes and farm terraces. The wall faded, slowly, from function into memory. And yet, even in disrepair, the wall never truly disappeared. It remained present in the consciousness of the people, invoked in proverbs, literature, and nationalist rhetoric. The idea of the wall outlived its practical use. Even as it crumbled, it continued to separate, not only land, but perception. Inside the wall, civilization. Outside, danger, difference, wilderness. That dichotomy, though softened by centuries, never vanished entirely. What often goes unsaid in romantic retellings is that the wall was never a singular structure, but a layered, uneven, often contradictory mess of competing goals. Some sections were carefully engineered fortresses, others were little more than dirt embankments. The earliest parts from the Warring States period still lie buried in sand. Ming sections soar in drone footage. In between are forgotten fragments, swallowed by desert and forest alike. Archaeologists today categorize the wall as multiple walls, tied to different dynasties: Qin, Han, Northern Wei, Sui, Tang, Ming, each building, abandoning, rebuilding. Not one wall, but an idea that dynasties inherited like an ancient curse: defend the north, or be destroyed by it. Modern surveys estimate that if every known wall, beacon tower, fort, and trench were combined, the total length exceeds 21,000 kilometers. That's more than half the circumference of Earth. But such numbers are abstractions. They say little of the suffering involved. No accurate count exists of how many died building it. Some say hundreds of thousands. Others say over 1 million across the centuries. deaths were rarely recorded unless they affected construction schedules. These were not soldiers or nobles. They were peasants, prisoners, exiles. Their stories are not carved in stone. They are buried beneath it. The wall also played a role in one of history's slowest, most invisible sieges, the siege of identity. While emperors used it to repel outsiders, they also used it to define what it meant to be Chinese. It reinforced an us versus them mentality that shaped imperial ideology. If the wall marked the border of civilization, then what lay beyond it was not simply foreign, it was uncivilized. This logic filtered into border policy, trade negotiations, even internal governance. Nomadic groups who lived within the frontier were watched, regulated, and often assimilated by force. The wall was both physical defense and mental boundary. It kept enemies out and kept certain truths in. Even after its functional death, the wall found new life as a symbol. In the 20th century, as China entered its revolutionary era, the wall was reinterpreted. Under the Communist Party, it became a metaphor for national strength and collective endurance. Schoolchildren were taught poems comparing the people's will to the wall's resilience. Propaganda posters depicted Mao Zedong as a modern-day builder, finishing the wall with ideology instead of stone. Ironically, the very regime that celebrated the wall as a national symbol also oversaw the destruction of many of its segments during the Cultural Revolution. Bricks were torn down, towers vandalized, slogans painted across ancient stone. The past was a dangerous thing in revolutionary China, unless it could be reframed. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the wall underwent yet another transformation into a tourist attraction. The Badeling section, heavily restored, became a site of national pilgrimage, a must-see for foreign dignitaries, camera crews, and patriotic school tours. But the tourist version is a carefully curated illusion. Clean, safe, lined with railings and souvenir shops, it hides the real wall, cracked, overgrown, weathered by time and neglect. Some segments have collapsed entirely. Others are now being swallowed by real estate development, road construction, or erosion. Preservation efforts have begun, but they are uneven. Some archaeologists risk arrest to document crumbling segments. Others find fragments buried under modern villages, their outlines barely visible from the air. The Great Wall, for all its scale, is surprisingly fragile. It was never meant to last this long without care, and yet it persists. Not because of magic or mortar, but because it has been endlessly reimagined. Each era made the wall its own, as defense, as punishment, as propaganda, as pride. To understand how the Great Wall worked is to understand how China has defined itself, through labor, through fear, through boundaries drawn not just in geography, but in memory. The wall was never truly about stopping others from entering. It was about telling those already inside who they were. Long before it became a UNESCO World Heritage Site, before tour buses rolled through Badeling and presidents posed on parapets, the Great Wall functioned as something both more mundane and more insidious, a system of control. The modern imagination likes to see walls as barriers, static, passive, mute. But the Great Wall was anything but that. It was dynamic, constantly manned, maintained, patrolled and adjusted. It wasn't just a structure, it was an institution, woven into the logistical, military and administrative fabric of imperial China. To keep it functional, the wall required an elaborate infrastructure that stretched far beyond the stones. Watchtowers, built at regular intervals, weren't merely scenic ruins. They formed a relay network for surveillance and rapid signalling. Soldiers stationed inside maintained firewood stocks, kept watch, and stood ready to light beacons in case of movement along the frontier. Smoke signals by day, fire by night. Combinations of flames and columns of smoke communicated warnings across vast distances. It was a communication system long before the telegraph, faster than any runner, and reliable enough to coordinate regional defences. In theory, In practice, weather often obscured visibility. Smoke signals could be missed in fog or snow. A tower unmanned due to disease or desertion created blind spots. And when attackers knew how the system worked, they learned to exploit its timing, striking between towers or at moments when visibility was low. But for all its limitations, the system helped define one of the Great Wall's most overlooked functions: information management. The wall was as much about knowing what was happening beyond the frontier as it was about keeping anyone from crossing it. The farther a threat could be detected, the more time local garrisons had to prepare, report, or evacuate. Beneath the towers and parapets were garrisons and forts, many of which are now eroded into rubble or lost beneath later construction. These were the backbones of the wall's defense strategy. Garrison towns housed thousands of soldiers, along with support staff, families, and civil officials. Roads and supply lines were built specifically to reach them. Granaries stored millet and rice. Blacksmiths maintained weapons. Bureaucrats logged inventories. If a tower was the eye, the garrison was the muscle. The men stationed at these outposts were often from other provinces, deliberately posted far from home to reduce the risk of local loyalties undermining imperial orders. Morale was a constant challenge. Letters from frontier soldiers reveal complaints of hunger, boredom, and isolation. Rations were often insufficient. Pay was delayed. And in winter, the wind could cut through armor as easily as flesh. Discipline was enforced with severity. A soldier caught sleeping on watch could be executed. Desertion was punished not only with death, but with collective punishment, sometimes involving the deserter's family. The Great Wall may have been built to keep enemies out, but it also served to keep soldiers in. And the soldiers were not the only ones surveilled. Merchants, travelers, diplomats, and nomadic envoys who approached the wall from the outside were carefully processed. The wall was dotted with border gates, guarded checkpoints where movement was regulated. Travelers had to present permits, goods were inspected, fees were assessed, spies were suspected everywhere. These gates, like Jiayuguan in the far west or Shanhaijuan in the east, were architectural marvels in their own right. Massive stone complexes with layered defenses, fortified courtyards, and inspection platforms. They were not just doorways, they were filters, designed to slow, separate, and scrutinize. For traders along the Silk Road, crossing the wall was not just a change in scenery. It was a shift in political climate. Inside the empire, the wall's presence loomed psychologically. In nearby villages, stories circulated of the horrors faced by those sent to build it. Folktales turned the wall into a cursed thing, haunted by ghosts of the starved and buried. One of the most famous legends, Mengjiangnu, tells of a woman whose husband was conscripted to work on the wall. When she arrived to bring him winter clothes, she found that he had already died from exhaustion, his body interred within the wall itself. She wept so bitterly that a section of the wall collapsed. The tale is not just tragedy, it's protest. A rare folk narrative that expresses sympathy for the faceless labourers, not the emperors who ordered their deaths. Archaeological studies confirm that many of the wall's workers were peasants forcibly conscripted from their villages. Others were convicts serving sentences, branded, chained, and marched to remote construction zones under military escort. Their labour contracts, if they existed at all, were verbal. Most had no chance of returning home. Tools were simple: picks, baskets, wooden scaffolding. The wall was not built with magic or advanced technology, but with repetition, endless, brutal repetition. Earth had to be tamped thousands of times per metre. Bricks had to be fired in kilns using precious wood. Stones had to be hauled by human chains up cliffs where animals could not tread. The term Great Wall did not describe its engineering. It described its appetite. In peacetime, the wall shrank into the background. Its soldiers became farmers. Its towers became pigeon coops. In times of war, it was suddenly vital again, and never quite ready. Still, It lingered, generation after generation, dynasty after dynasty. Administrators argued over its usefulness, debated its budget, lamented its failures, and continued to fund it. It became too large to ignore, too expensive to maintain, and too symbolic to abandon. It is easy to think of the wall as a monolith, something finished, perfect, untouchable. But the truth is that the Great Wall was never finished. Sections were always under repair, towers always crumbling, soldiers always complaining, engineers always negotiating with terrain and weather and imperial indecision. The wall wasn't a structure, it was a process, one that never really stopped. Even now, millennia later, that process continues in a new form: preservation, excavation, reconstruction, myth-making. Bricks are no longer hauled up mountains, but tourists are. Watchtowers no longer signal invasion, but Wi-Fi strength. The Great Wall no longer defends an empire, but it still stands guard over memory, over identity, and over the silence of those who gave everything to raise it. The Great Wall's strength was never just in its stone. It was in the idea that stone could impose order on the wilderness, that chaos could be walled out and harmony walled in. It was less a structure than a philosophy, the physical embodiment of the Chinese imperial worldview: defined borders, central authority, civilization ringed by submission. But ideas need upkeep, and no wall, however high, can defend against time. By the late Qing dynasty, the wall had become a relic, still looming, still vast, but militarily obsolete. The nature of threats had changed. Guns and artillery ignored fortifications. Railroads ignored terrain. Diplomacy, corruption, and internal rebellion became greater dangers than mounted raiders from the steppe. And yet the wall remained, crumbling, half forgotten, but still there. Because once you build something that big, no one knows quite what to do with it. Sections were cannibalized. Villagers dismantled towers to reuse the bricks. Farmers tilled soil up to its base. In some places, the wall became part of the village itself: fences, paths, goat pens. Its stonework survived not because of reverence, but because it was useful. The wall had outlived the empire that built it and the enemies it was meant to stop. And yet, even in this slow decay, its symbolic power endured. In the early 20th century, as China staggered through revolution, warlordism, foreign occupation, and civil war, the wall became a reference point, a memory of order amid fragmentation. When the Republic of China was proclaimed in 1912, the wall appeared in nationalist rhetoric, the bones of the past that could still support a modern China. During the Second Sino-Japanese War, parts of the wall saw renewed military activity. In 1933, the Battle of the Great Wall was fought between Chinese and Japanese forces near the Rihe province. Ironically, the wall, never designed for modern warfare, now served as a symbolic front line. Trenches were dug behind its parapets. Machine guns rattled across its crumbling towers. It could no longer stop invaders, but it could still provide cover. Later, during the Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976, the wall suffered from ideological purging. Mao's Red Guards targeted anything that smelled of feudalism, and the wall, with its imperial origins and dynastic associations, was treated not as a national treasure, but as an outdated monument to the old order. Bricks were taken, slogans were painted, towers vandalized. In some places, whole sections were bulldozed to make room for collectivized farmland. And still, it remained, because the wall had always survived by adapting, not physically, but symbolically. Under Deng Xiaoping's leadership in the 1980s, as China reopened to the world, the wall was suddenly recast once more, now as a point of pride, a relic of national greatness that could serve tourism, diplomacy, and cultural identity. The government began to restore key sections, most notably Beiderling, turning it into a showcase of Chinese endurance and civilization. Foreign dignitaries were photographed there. Schoolchildren were sent on patriotic field trips. Travel posters depicted the wall at sunset, majestic and eternal, its political history bleached out under golden light. What had once been a tool of oppression was now a symbol of unity. But restoration was selective. Only about 8% of the wall is formally maintained. The rest, thousands of kilometers, lies in various states of ruin, erosion, and near invisibility. Some segments are buried under sediment, visible only from aerial photography. Others have been swallowed by creeping desert. Modern development has cut across it in highways and housing projects. Earthquakes and flooding have taken more. The Great Wall survives not because it is protected, but because it is too big to disappear quickly. Preservation efforts in the 21st century have been inconsistent. Local governments, often underfunded and overwhelmed, struggle to maintain their segments. Some have turned to concrete and steel to restore towers, resulting in inauthentic reconstructions. Others simply let it rot. Scholars and archaeologists sound alarms, but the wall is too long to save all at once. Efforts to digitize it using drones, satellite imaging, and 3D modeling have begun, an attempt to preserve the wall in data, if not in stone. And yet, even as it fades, it is remembered. For tourists, it's a selfie backdrop. For historians, it's a palimpsest of dynastic engineering and imperial will. For locals, it's part of the terrain, a trail, a quarry, a curiosity. For nationalists, it's proof of ancient greatness. For dissidents, it's a reminder of forced labor and state power. And for the ghosts, of peasants buried alive, soldiers frozen on watch, masons crushed under stone, it is a tomb that forgot its builders. But perhaps the most revealing truth about the Great Wall is this. It never actually worked the way it was supposed to. It didn't stop invasions. It didn't keep dynasties alive. It didn't define a permanent boundary. It failed again and again and was rebuilt again and again. Not because of success, but because of belief. The wall was never merely a defense. It was a performance, a ritual, a statement made in stone. A dynasty builds a wall not because it knows it will hold, but because it needs to be seen building one. The wall was theatre on a continental scale. It declared in rock and mortar that the empire was vigilant, that it was unified, that it had borders, that it was civilized in contrast to the wild, the foreign, the other, that it deserved to exist. And like all theatre, it was illusion wrapped around truth. The wall could not stop the Mongols. It could not stop the Manchus. It could not stop time. But it could convince millions for generations that safety was a matter of stone. That walls once raised would hold forever. They didn't, but they're still there. The Great Wall, in its final form, is not a singular achievement. It is a layered consequence. It is not simply an architectural wonder, but a monument to contradiction. Grandeur built on exploitation, unity constructed through exclusion, defense that repeatedly failed and yet somehow endured. To admire the wall today is to look at the surface of something that was never meant to be seen up close. From afar, it is magnificent, a dragon of stone stretched across mountains. But step closer, and the gaps appear. The mismatched bricks, the crude repairs, the uneven geometry of dynasties building on the bones of the ones before. This is not the perfection of a single vision. It is the residue of centuries of improvisation and fear. Its purpose, too, was never singular. Yes, it was a defense, at least in theory, but it was also an economic barrier, a customs checkpoint, a communications network, a psychological marker, a labor camp, and a political stage. Every brick carried weight, not just of the material itself, but of the intentions behind it. The wall told outsiders, "We are watching." It told insiders, "Stay loyal." It told emperors, "You are in control." and it told the labourers silently and without compassion, "You are disposable." In that sense, the wall is more than architecture. It is a physical record of state logic. It represents the ability of centralized power to command nature, to command people, and to reshape geography itself to reflect political will. Yet for all its ambition, the wall was never absolute. The steps could not be tamed by stone. The horse always found a way around the fortress, and every era that believed it could seal the frontier with mortar eventually learned that culture, commerce, and conquest do not stop at border checkpoints. That failure is not shameful, it is human. Empires build walls not because they are strong, but because they are afraid. And the bigger the wall, the greater the fear. What then remains of the wall today? Physically, fragments. The best known parts, like Bardeling or Mutianyu, gleam under restoration, their stone cleaned, their parapets secure, their steps conquered daily by millions of feet. These are the postcard walls, not false, but polished. Then, there are the forgotten sections, crumbling mud ramparts in Gansu, collapsed towers in Inner Mongolia, beacon posts now marked only by their shadow at dusk. They belong to no one and everyone, scattered along hillsides, eroded by wind and time, sometimes mistaken for natural ridges. Culturally, the wall persists as metaphor. It is invoked in speeches, textbooks, and slogans. It stands for endurance, discipline, and resilience. It represents Chineseness, though the people who built it often died in anonymity, and the people it sought to keep out were sometimes absorbed into the very empire that commissioned it. Politically, the wall is useful. It is a ready symbol for unity, for sovereignty, for strength. No nation resists the temptation to turn monuments into mirrors, but the truth of the wall, as with all great monuments, is not found in its height or length, but in the stories buried beneath it. The story of the wall is the story of those who hauled stone with bleeding hands, who dug ditches by moonlight, who died of thirst on scaffoldings, who were whipped for pausing too long, who were told that their suffering was in service to something greater, even if they never saw it completed, even if their names were never recorded. It is the story of generals debating over maps, of emperors drawing lines with ink, of engineers measuring soil and grain ratios, of merchants waiting at frozen passes, of soldiers stamping feet in -20 winds. It is a story of bureaucratic orders issued in distant capitals and carried out by men who did not know how to write. And it is the story of memory, how we choose what to remember and how we polish the past to make it shine just enough for a camera lens. Perhaps, in the end, the wall did succeed, not as a defense but as a symbol. It kept no invader out permanently. It protected no dynasty forever. But it convinced the world that it stood for something eternal. That stone could hold back time. That labor could shape legacy. But legacies, like walls, require maintenance. If you do not tend them, they collapse. If you do not question them, they harden. If you do not honor the cost of their creation, they become lies, beautiful, scenic, and hollow. Today, visitors climb its towers and run fingers along the seams of ancient bricks. They take pictures, pose, laugh. They walk its length in silence. They imagine emperors and battles, dragons and myths. Few think of the men who died mixing mortar. Few notice the sections where the wall is not made of stone, but of tamped mud and dried blood. But they walk it nonetheless. And in doing so, they carry it forward, not as defenders or subjects, but as witnesses. Because the wall, for all its might, does not speak, it does not warn, it does not boast. It simply waits for someone to look closer, for someone to ask who built it and who paid the price.